The recoil of the rifle was a familiar, brutal kiss against her shoulder. Vera Callahan held her breath, the world narrowing to the silver-etched crosshairs and the heart of the monster standing on the opposing ridge. 3 years she had hunted him. 3 years of ghosts and whispers, of cold trails and colder purpose. And here he was, Theron Valeris, the Vampire King, outlined against a sky the color of a fresh bruise, standing before the very cabin where she had led him. For 2 weeks she had left a trail of carefully planted evidence, signs of a human settlement, rumors of a hidden resistance meeting, traces of her own passage that seemed just careless enough to be real. She had studied his patterns, learned how he thought, understood that his cursed sense of honor would make him investigate personally rather than send his soldiers. She had watched the mountain's temperament, the snow accumulating in precarious cornices above the ridge, the weather patterns that promised a storm. The cabin sat in a natural funnel, a perfect kill zone. She would shoot him with her silver bullet, wound him gravely, and if the world was kind, the coming storm would trigger an avalanche that would bury them both. She was willing to die if it meant taking him with her. The crack of the shot split the frozen silence. She saw the impact, the dark spray against the snow, the way his regal posture shattered. He fell, and in the hollow chamber of her chest, something that felt like vengeance began to sing. But the mountain had been waiting. The rifle's report echoed once, twice, then the slope above them groaned with an ancient, terrible voice. Her plan had worked too well. The world dissolved into a fury of white. She ran, lungs burning, legs pumping through knee-deep powder, diving through the cabin door just as the white wave crested the ridge. The impact was like a fist slamming into the world. The door splintered inward. The frame screamed. Snow blasted through every gap, and then the crushing weight of the avalanche slammed everything shut, plunging the world into deep, muffled twilight. She was a hunter, the last of Oakhaven's daughters. He was Theron Valeris, the Vampire King, the butcher of her people. An avalanche had claimed them both, burying hunter and monster together in a forgotten cabin beneath a world of snow. What was lost was the sun, the sky, the entire world she knew. What remained was a single, flickering candle of life, and the impossible choice of who would be allowed to burn it. This is the story of a reckoning in a room too small for monsters. A war fought in the space between 2 slowing heartbeats. Vera woke to the taste of blood and pine dust. Consciousness returned, not as a gentle dawn, but as a door kicked open in her mind. Pain, sharp and crystalline, lanced through her ribs with every ragged breath. She was on her back, staring up at a ceiling of rough-hewn logs draped in the patient lace of cobwebs. A thick wool blanket, smelling of damp and mice, was thrown over her. The cabin, she had made it inside. But the door had exploded inward, the frame groaning in protest before the weight of the world slammed it shut. Panic, cold and suffocating as the snow itself, seized her. She sat up too fast, and the world swam in a nauseous gray. Her head throbbed in time with her pulse, a frantic drumbeat in the profound silence. The only light came from a single high window, a grimy pane of glass clogged with a solid wall of packed snow, admitting a faint, bruised blue luminescence. It was enough to see. Enough to confirm she was not alone. He was there. Theron Valeris lay on the floor near the stone hearth, a long, dark shape against the dusty floorboards. For a moment, she thought he was dead. The triumphant song that had started in her chest faltered, replaced by the icy dread of absolute solitude. If he was dead, she would be next. The cold was already a living thing in the small space, its teeth sunk deep into her flesh. She wouldn't last 2 weeks alone. She pushed the blanket aside, her movements stiff and agonizing. Every muscle screamed in protest. Her rifle. Where was her rifle? Her eyes scanned the small one-room cabin. A rickety table, 1 chair, a cot with a rotted mattress and the cold black maw of the fireplace. Her pack was near the door, half buried in a drift of fine powder that had blasted through the broken frame. Her rifle was nowhere. It must have been torn from her grasp by the avalanche's fury. Buried under 100 feet of snow. She was disarmed, trapped. A low sound broke the stillness. A rough, wet sound. A groan of profound pain. His head moved just an inch, turning toward her. In the gloom, his eyes were pits of shadow, but she felt their weight. He was alive. The Vampire King, the ageless terror, the architect of her ruin, was alive and bleeding out on her floor. She could see it now, the dark, spreading stain on the side of his fine wool coat, black as pitch in the dim light. Her silver bullet. It had found its mark. Not the heart, clearly, but close enough to do its work. Silver was poison to his kind. But she knew the old hunter's wisdom. A vampire weakened to the point of death loses everything that makes them dangerous. The compulsion, the inhuman strength, even the healing, all of it drains away, leaving something barely above mortal. In his state, with her training, she could stake him before he'd cross the room. She got to her feet, using the wall for support, her body a symphony of aches. A broken rib, at least. Probably a concussion. Nothing that wouldn't heal. Nothing like the wound she had given him. She limped toward him, her hunting knife a cold, reassuring weight at her belt. This was it. The end of her quest. 3 years of tracking him, of living on bitter herbs and staler hope, had led to this. All she had to do was wait. The silver and the cold would finish him. He watched her approach, his breathing shallow and ragged. He didn't speak. He didn't have the strength. The legendary power, the force that had leveled armies and toppled kingdoms, was reduced to this. A wounded animal shivering on a dusty floor. The arrogance was gone from his face, stripped away by pain, leaving behind something stark and unsettlingly human. The sharp, aristocratic lines of his cheekbones, the proud set of his jaw. It was all still there, but muted, blurred by suffering. So, this is how it ends. Not in a throne room, but in a forgotten hovel. Poetic. He closed his eyes, a muscle feathered in his jaw. The bullet. Silver. I'm aware, she said, the words brittle as ice. I made it myself. She had spent a week melting down her mother's locket, pouring the molten silver with hands that shook with hate and grief, whispering the names of the dead into the metal as it cooled. The names of her neighbors, her friends, her mother. He tried to push himself up, and a shudder racked his entire frame. He fell back with a choked cry, his hand flying to the wound. Even in the blue gloom, she could see the faint curl of smoke rising from the edges of the hole in his coat, where the silver was in direct contact with his flesh. It was burning him, cooking him from the inside. Good. She turned away from him, her duty, her entire purpose in life, lying wounded at her feet. But survival was a more ancient instinct than revenge. She went to her pack, rummaging through it with numb fingers. She had packed for a siege, knowing the mountains could trap her. 2 loaves of dense black bread wrapped in oilcloth, a large pouch of dried venison and rabbit, a smaller pouch of dried berries and nuts, a wheel of hard cheese, packets of dried beans and lentils, a jar of rendered fat, salt. It was enough for one person to last perhaps 8 weeks if she was careful. For 2, well, that depended on whether he even needed food. She had no idea if vampires ate. She had to make a fire. She found a small stack of firewood next to the hearth, dry and blessedly untouched by the snow. Someone had stocked this place, perhaps a trapper or hunter who used it seasonally. There was more wood stacked against the outer wall, enough for several weeks if she was frugal. Her hands trembled as she struck the flint, the sparks dying uselessly in the frigid air. Again. Finally, A spark caught on the tinder she'd prepared, a fragile orange ember that she nurtured with her own breath, coaxing it into a tiny, hopeful flame. The fire caught, crackling to life, pushing back the oppressive cold and filling the cabin with a warm, dancing light. The light fell across him, illuminating the severity of his injury. The blood had soaked through his coat and the fine linen shirt beneath, matting the fabric to his skin. His face was pale as bone, slick with a cold sweat. His lips were tinged with blue. He was dying faster than she'd anticipated. And a new, colder fear began to eclipse the warmth of her hatred. If he died tonight, the fire would be her only companion. When the wood ran out in a few weeks, the cold would claim her. If he died, she would die. The thought was a violation, a betrayal of everything she stood for. She, Vera Callahan, needed Theron Valeris to live. "You have to get it out," he breathed, his eyes open again, fixed on her. The command was gone from his voice, replaced by a raw, desperate plea. "Why should I?" she shot back, her voice sharp with self-loathing. "So you can heal, get your strength back, and kill me in my sleep?" "If you leave it in, I will die," he said, each word a monumental effort. "The silver has spread through my system like ink in water. Removing the bullet will stop the active poisoning, but the corruption remains. I need clean blood to flush it out, to repair the damage." He paused, gathering strength. "And you will not last the winter alone. You know this." He was right. Damn him, he was right. The logic was as cold and inescapable as the snow locking them in. Her survival was chained to his. It was a bitter, gagging pill to swallow. "What guarantee do I have?" she demanded, circling him like a wary wolf. "That you won't just drain me dry the second you can stand?" A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "You have my word." She laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The word of a king who slaughtered my entire village? Forgive me if I don't find that reassuring." His eyes clouded over. For a second, something other than pain flickered there, something deeper, older. "Oakhaven, it was not as you think." "Save your lies," she snarled, the grief fresh and sharp as a shard of glass in her throat. "I saw the bodies. I saw what your soldiers did." He didn't argue. He just watched her, his breath hitching, another tremor running through him. The silver was working its poison deep into his system. She didn't have much time to decide. Let him die and condemn herself to a slow, freezing death, preserving her hate as a final, useless monument? Or save him, violate every vow she had ever made, and live? She stared into the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows that looked like ghosts. The faces of her family, her friends. They accused her. "You would help him? After what he did to us?" But the instinct to draw another breath was a powerful, tyrannical thing. It cared nothing for vows or vengeance. It only cared about the sunrise. "Fine," she bit out, the word tasting like ash. "I'll help you, but you will owe me. You will keep me alive until the spring. That's the deal." He managed a slow, deliberate nod. "The deal is struck." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She grabbed one of the candles, lit it from the fire, and set it on the floor beside him, its steady flame providing better light. Then she unsheathed her hunting knife. The blade was clean, wickedly sharp. "This is going to hurt. I have endured worse." She knelt beside him. The proximity was nauseating. She could smell him, the scent of cold stone, night air, and blood. It was the smell of the enemy. She used her knife to slice through his coat and shirt, peeling the blood-soaked fabric away from the wound. The flesh around the entry point was blackened, cauterized by the silver's touch. It was a nasty, weeping wound and deep. The bullet had lodged somewhere in the muscle and tissue of his side, perilously close to his lung. She would have to dig for it. "Don't move," she ordered, pressing her palm flat against his chest to hold him steady. His skin was unnaturally cold, but beneath it she could feel the faint, slow thrum of his heart. It was a strange, disorienting sensation, feeling life in the thing she'd only ever wanted to kill. He gritted his teeth, his eyes screwed shut. She took another breath, pushed aside the image of her mother's face, and made the first cut. He didn't scream. A strangled hiss of pain escaped his lips, his whole body going rigid, but he did not scream. She worked quickly, methodically, her hunter's knowledge of anatomy serving a purpose she could never have imagined. The knife sliced deeper, and blood, dark and sluggish, welled up. It didn't look like human blood. It was thicker, almost black in the candlelight. Her fingers, slick with his blood, probed the wound. He flinched violently, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Steady," she commanded, her voice harder than she intended. She was concentrating, blocking everything else out. The ghosts, the hate, the impossible intimacy of this moment. There was only the wound, the knife, and the bullet she had to find. She felt it. A small, hard lump lodged against a rib. She angled the knife, using the tip to pry at it, to work it loose. His breath hitched, and for a terrifying second, she thought he might lose consciousness. But he remained still, his control absolute even in the face of agony. With a final sickening scrape of metal on bone, the bullet came free. She plucked it from the wound with her fingers, a twisted piece of silver, dark and stained. Her mother's locket. She held it in her palm, this small, hateful object that had connected them in violence and now bound them in survival. Theron let out a long, shuddering breath, his head falling back against the floorboards. The tension in his body seemed to drain away, leaving him utterly limp. The immediate threat of the silver was gone, but he was still gravely wounded, still bleeding, still dying. Just more slowly now. Vera stared at the wound she had made, a fresh, clean cut layered over the ragged, burned hole of the bullet. It was bleeding freely now, the dark blood pooling on the floor. She knew they couldn't heal without blood. It was the first lesson of any hunter. Their fuel, their medicine, the source of their unnatural life. Vampires could survive for months without feeding. They would enter a death-like torpor, barely conscious, barely alive. But they could not heal without it, and they could not return to strength without regular feeding. He had lost a great deal, and in this frozen wasteland, there was only one source. Her. The thought made her stomach churn. She backed away from him, wiping his blood from her hands onto her trousers, the gesture one of pure revulsion. She had done her part. She had removed the bullet. The rest was up to him. She would not be his meal. She would rather take her chances with the cold. She spent the next hour fortifying the cabin. She found some loose floorboards and used them to patch the broken doorframe, wedging them into place to block the worst of the wind and drifting snow. The cabin was small, but it was sturdy. It would hold. The immediate crisis of shelter was handled. Now came the longer, slower crisis of attrition. By nightfall, the fire was a cheerful, crackling blaze, but it did little to warm the frozen dread in Vera's heart. Theron had not moved. His breathing had grown shallower, his skin had taken on a gray, waxy sheen. The bleeding from his side had slowed to a sluggish ooze, but he was not healing. The edges of the wound remained stubbornly open, the flesh refusing to knit itself back together. He was too weak. He was starving. She sat on the opposite side of the hearth, chewing on a piece of dried meat that tasted like leather and fear. She watched him, waiting. For what, she wasn't sure. For him to die, so her choice would be made for her? For him to miraculously recover, so she could go back to hating him without complication? Neither happened. He just lay there, fading. Hours passed. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound. The fire crackled. His breathing hitched. It was the only rhythm in their silent world. She tried to sleep, curling up in the foul-smelling blanket on the cot, but her eyes wouldn't stay closed. Every time she drifted off, she saw her mother's face, her eyes wide with terror. Then she would see Theron bleeding on the floor, and a different kind of terror would grip her, the terror of being alone. Sometime before dawn, in the darkest, coldest hour, he spoke. His voice was a thread of sound, barely audible over the fire. "Please." One word, not a command, not a demand, a plea. It stripped away the king, the monster, the legend, and left only a dying man. Vera squeezed her eyes shut. "No, I won't. I can't." She thought of the fangs, the violation, the stories told in hushed whispers around the fire back home, of villagers found pale and empty in their beds, of the unholy thirst that drove them. But then she thought of the weeks stretching ahead, the crushing solitude, the howling wind, the inevitable day the firewood would run out, the slow, creeping numbness of freezing to death. Her own body, stiff and pale, discovered by hunters in the spring. Her survival instinct was a feral thing, and it was winning. With a curse that was half a sob, she got up. She walked over to him, her legs feeling like lead. She knelt by his head, her heart hammering against her ribs. He watched her, his dark eyes lucid, filled with a desperate, waiting stillness. She didn't offer her neck. That was too intimate, too much like the stories. A gesture of submission she refused to make. Instead, she held out her left arm, baring the pale, tender skin of her inner wrist. Just enough to live. That's the deal. He gave the faintest of nods. He was too weak to lift his head. She had to lower her arm to his mouth. Her hand trembled violently. This was wrong. This was a desecration of every belief she held, a betrayal of every person she had ever loved. His lips, cold and dry, brushed against her skin. She flinched, a full-body shudder of revulsion. She wanted to pull away, to run, to let him die. But she held still. His mouth opened, and she felt the needle-sharp prick of his fangs. It was not a savage bite, but a precise, almost delicate puncture. The sensation was not what she expected. There was a brief, sharp pain, but it was immediately followed by a strange, spreading warmth. A dizzying lightness bloomed in her head, and the cabin seemed to recede, the firelight blurring at the edges of her vision. It was not unpleasant, and that, more than anything, terrified her. She felt the gentle, rhythmic pull as he drank. She watched his face. The deep lines of pain around his eyes seemed to soften. A faint flush of color was returning to his cheeks. He was drawing her life into himself, and she could feel her own strength ebbing, replaced by a languid weakness. Enough. He stopped instantly. He released her wrist, his head falling back. 2 small, perfect beads of her blood welled up from the puncture marks. He licked his lips, and his eyes met hers. They were clearer now, the fog of death receding. "Thank you." She scrambled back, pressing herself against the far wall, her hand clutching her wrist. She felt violated, tainted. But she also felt the undeniable truth. They were both still alive. She had made a pact with the devil, and for now, the devil was holding up his end of the bargain. The days that followed fell into a grim, surreal routine. By day, Vera tended to their survival. She was ruthlessly efficient. She rationed their food carefully, a quarter loaf of bread, a handful of dried meat, some nuts each day for herself. She discovered he did not need food, only blood. She ventured out into the blinding white of the snow-choked landscape to gather more firewood, and spent hours melting snow for water. The world outside the cabin was a uniform, hostile white. The snow was packed so high against the small structure that only the roof and the very top of the window were visible. They were well and truly buried. By night, she fed him, but not every night. He insisted they wait, 4 days, sometimes 5, between feedings. "You're weakening," he would say, his voice quiet but firm. "I can wait. I heal slowly, but I heal." It never got easier. Every few evenings, as the light failed and the cold deepened its hold, a knot of dread would tighten in her stomach. She would sit by the fire, watching him, and he would watch her. He never demanded, he never rushed her, he simply waited. He had regained some of his strength. He could sit up now, propped against the wall. The wound in his side, once a festering blackened pit, had finally begun to heal. The flesh was slowly, miraculously, knitting itself back together. Her blood was his medicine. The ritual was always the same. She would kneel beside him, she would offer her wrist. He would drink, never taking more than she allowed, stopping the instant she whispered, "Enough." But the terror of the act was now mingled with a strange, unnerving intimacy. In those moments, with her pulse fluttering against his lips, the line between hunter and hunted, between savior and monster, blurred into nothing. She learned the sound of his breathing, the way his eyes would close as he drank, the faint tremor in his hands when he was at his weakest. She was keeping him alive with pieces of herself, and she hated him for it. She hated herself more. They rarely spoke. The silence was a third entity in the room, heavy and fraught with unspoken history. What was there to say? Tell me again how you murdered my mother? Thank you for not draining me dry last night. The chasm between them was too wide, filled with too much blood and grief. But one night, about 3 weeks into their shared imprisonment, he broke the silence. She had just pulled her wrist away, feeling the familiar wave of dizziness. She was lightheaded, her own reserves dwindling. She was getting thinner, paler, her hands shaking more often. She was pouring her life into him, and it was taking its toll. "You're from Oakhaven," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was quiet, but it held a new resonance, the strength she had given him. Vera froze, her back to him. "Don't say the name of my home." "Your family's sigil was the rowan tree, was it not? I saw the carving on your knife hilt." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "What of it?" He looked down at his hands. For the first time, she saw something like weariness in his posture, a weight that had nothing to do with his physical wound. "I remember the rowan trees that lined the path to the village square. They were beautiful in the autumn." The casual intimacy of the memory was a slap in the face. "You have no right to remember my home. You, who burned it to the ground." "I did not give that order, Vera." He used her name. He had never used her name before. It sent a strange shiver down her spine. "Liar!" "It was my general, Mordecai. He acted against my command. He had ambitions. He believed my methods were too soft. He thought a show of overwhelming force would quell the human resistance in the Northern Territories for good." Vera just stared at him, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. It was a story, a convenient, self-serving story designed to absolve him of his sins. She wouldn't believe it. "He marched on Oakhaven while I was in the South, treating with the Lichen clans. He told the soldiers the order came from me. By the time I received word of what had happened, it was over. The village was gone, and I was branded a butcher." "A brand you wear so well." A flicker of pain crossed his face, so quick she almost missed it. "Mordecai presented me with a victory. He thought I would be pleased. He misjudged me." "And what did you do?" Vera challenged, taking a step closer, fueled by a righteous, familiar rage. "Give him a stern talking to? Dock his pay?" Theron's eyes were dark, ancient pools of regret. "I executed him. A year later. It took me that long to unravel his network of lies, to prove his treason to the rest of my court. I tore him apart with my own hands in the throne room, in front of everyone who had believed his lies about me." The image was so vivid, so violent, that Vera felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She wanted to believe it was another lie, but the raw, unvarnished pain in his voice felt real. It unsettled her. It threatened the very foundation of her hatred, and that was a terrifying prospect. Hatred was all she had left. "I don't believe you," You're the king. Everything that happens under your rule is your responsibility. You are just as guilty." "You are right," he conceded, and the simple agreement stunned her into silence. "I am. I was his king. His failure is my failure. His stain is my stain. I cannot wash your family's blood from my hands, regardless of who wielded the sword." He paused. "But I did not give the order. I would not have. That is the truth." She turned her back on him, wrapping her arms around herself. She couldn't look at him anymore, couldn't listen to the quiet reason in his voice that was chipping away at the walls she had built around her heart. It was easier when he was a monster. It was simpler. This was complicated. This was a man, burdened and regretful, and she didn't know how to hate a man. She only knew how to hate a monster. The silence that fell between them after that was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with his words, his claims, his truth, or his lie. They hung in the air, a constant, nagging question mark. Vera tried to ignore them. She focused on her tasks, on the rhythm of survival. Chop wood, melt snow, endure the feeding, sleep, repeat. But she couldn't ignore the change in him. He was healing. The wound was nearly closed, a puckered, angry scar on his side. His strength was returning daily. He moved with a fluid grace now, even in the cramped cabin. He helped her, splitting the firewood with an effortless strength that made her own efforts look clumsy, or tending the fire while she slept. They were becoming partners. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. She saw the way he stared into the flames for hours, his face a mask of sorrow. She saw the careful way he moved, as if his own body were a cage. She saw an ancient, profound loneliness in him that resonated with the aching void in her own soul. He never spoke of Oakhaven again. He seemed to understand that she could not bear it. Instead, he told her other things. Stories from his long, long life. He spoke of watching the great pyramids of Egypt being built, of walking the streets of ancient Rome, of sailing with Vikings across storm-tossed seas. He spoke of centuries of watching the world change, of watching everyone he ever knew turn to dust. He wasn't bragging, he was confessing. He was showing her the shape of his own prison, one made of time instead of snow. Vera listened, against her will. She told herself it was a tactic, a way to lull her into a false sense of security. But as the weeks bled into the 4th, then the 5th, the lines of her certainty began to blur. One afternoon, about 5 weeks in, Vera tried to lift the axe to split more wood and found she couldn't. Her arms trembled with the effort and the axe slipped from her grasp, thudding into the snow. She stood there, breathing hard, staring at her shaking hands. Theron appeared beside her, moving with that unsettling speed. He picked up the axe as if it weighed nothing. "You're too weak. We're spacing the feedings too far apart. You need more time to recover." "I'm fine," she said, but even she could hear the lie in her voice. She was exhausted all the time now. Her vision swam when she stood too quickly. Her heart raced with the slightest exertion. "You're not fine. And I won't take from you again until you are." He split the wood himself, his movements efficient and powerful, while she watched, feeling useless and frustrated and secretly, shamefully grateful. That night, he didn't ask to feed. Or the next night, or the night after that. She watched him grow paler again, the flush of health draining from his face, but he said nothing. He was choosing to weaken himself rather than risk her. The realization did something strange to her heart, something she wasn't ready to name. Another week passed. One afternoon she was mending a tear in her jacket. The constant trips outside in the cold were taking their toll on her clothing. As she worked, she noticed something odd about the inner lining of Theron's coat, which hung by the door. It bulged slightly, as if something were tucked inside. Before she could think better of it, she reached for the coat. Her fingers found a leather-bound book tucked into an interior pocket, worn soft with age and handling. A journal. She shouldn't. It was his private property. But the question of Oakhaven, the question of his guilt, was a constant ache in her mind. Her fingers opened the cover. The pages were filled with his elegant script, dated entries spanning decades. Most were mundane, notes about court politics, observations about the changing world, records of his travels, but as she flipped through, certain entries caught her eye. One, dated 2 years ago. Word reached me today of another village that credits me with its destruction. Another atrocity I did not order, could not have prevented, and will forever be blamed for. Mordecai's ghost haunts me still. The name Butcher King follows me like a shadow. I have tried for decades to rule with mercy, to prove that our kind and theirs can coexist. But men like Mordecai, and the humans who commit atrocities in my name, make peace seem like a fool's dream. Sometimes I wonder if I should simply become the monster they believe me to be. It would be easier than this endless, futile struggle. Another entry, dated a few months later. I executed another of my generals today. He had been raiding human settlements, blaming the orders on me, just as Mordecai did. How many are there in my court who see my restraint as weakness? How many believe the old ways, conquest, domination, blood, are the only ways? I am so tired. So very tired. And then, an entry from 3 years ago, just after Oakhaven. Oakhaven is ash. I arrived too late. The rowan trees, centuries old, beautiful beyond words, burned to char. The villagers, dead to the last child. Mordecai stood in the square, triumphant, expecting my praise. I saw her then, a young woman, barely more than a girl, standing at the edge of the ruins. She wore a hunter's leathers. Her face was streaked with ash and tears. Our eyes met across the devastation, and in her gaze I saw such pure, perfect hatred that it stole my breath. She raised a crossbow, fired. The bolt missed me by inches. I could have stopped it, but I found I didn't want to. I deserved her hate. I deserved her bolt through my heart. She ran before my guards could seize her, disappearing into the forest like a ghost. I have thought of her often in the years since, the girl with the rowan tree carved on her knife. I wonder if she survived. I wonder if her hatred keeps her warm at night, the way my guilt keeps me cold. Vera's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the journal. She had been there that day. She remembered taking that shot, remembered his face as he stood in the ruins of her home. She had thought his stillness was arrogance, but he had been grieving? She kept reading, unable to stop. Page after page of his private thoughts, his struggles, his regrets, his loneliness, his bone-deep weariness with a world that saw him as a monster and a court that wanted him to be one. She looked up. Theron stood in the doorway, having just returned from checking the snares outside. He saw the journal in her hands, and his entire body went still. For a long moment, neither of them moved. She waited for anger, for him to snatch it away, to accuse her of violating his privacy. Instead, he just looked tired. So now you know. You've been carrying this guilt for years. All this time, you've been trying to fix what he broke, and the world just keeps blaming you. He stepped inside, closing the door against the cold. I am to blame, Vera. I chose my advisors poorly. I was too trusting. I let men like Mordecai rise to power. Every village they destroyed, every human they killed, it happened under my rule, under my name. She set the journal down carefully and stood, moving toward him. But you didn't want it. You didn't order it. You've spent years trying to make it right. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the weight of centuries. Does that matter? The dead are still dead. Your mother is still gone. Oakhaven is still ash. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before settling on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily, outside of the feeding. "It matters to me." Something shifted in the air between them, a wall crumbling that could never be rebuilt. The truth was out, not handed to her, but discovered in his most private thoughts. And the truth was complicated and painful, and nothing like the simple story of good and evil she had carried for 3 years. The discovery of the journal changed everything. The air in the cabin shifted, the suffocating tension replaced by a fragile, uncertain quiet. When she fed him again 3 days later, insisting he needed it despite his protests, it felt different. It was still a necessity, but now it felt less like a surrender and more like a sacrament, a shared and silent acknowledgement of their bond. She no longer flinched from his touch. He was more careful than ever, his movements gentle, almost reverent. A strange, unspoken tenderness grew in the space between them. They began to talk, truly talk. She told him about Oakhaven before the fire, about the festivals, the way the sunlight looked slanting through the rowan trees, the smell of her mother's baking. She spoke of her training as a hunter, of the cold, hard certainty that had guided her life, a certainty that now felt like a child's fantasy. He, in turn, showed her more of himself. He spoke of love found and lost to the unforgiving march of time, of friendships that lasted a human lifetime, which for him was but the blink of an eye. He confessed his weariness, the exhaustion of ruling a court filled with ambitious, predatory creatures like Mordecai, the constant vigilance required to keep his own, more monstrous instincts in check. He was a king who hated the politics of his own kingdom, a predator who longed for a peace he could never truly have. She learned that his reputation as a butcher was Mordecai's legacy, a lie that many of his own people believed, a stain he had been trying to cleanse for decades. He ruled not with an iron fist, but with a reluctant, heavy hand, trying to forge a balance between his world and hers, a balance that men like Mordecai were determined to shatter. One evening, as she was tending the fire, a log shifted and a hot ember spat out, landing on the back of her hand. She cried out, more in surprise than pain, and instinctively pulled her hand back. Before she could even react, Theron was there. He moved with that unsettling speed, kneeling in front of her. "Let me see." He took her hand in his. His own were cool, his touch surprisingly gentle. He examined the small red mark, his brow furrowed with concern. Then he did something that stunned her. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft, cool kiss to the burn. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply intimate, that all the air left her lungs. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She stared at him, at the top of his dark head, at the way his fingers curled protectively around hers. When he looked up, his dark eyes were filled with an emotion so raw and open, it made her ache. It was not hunger. It was not pity. It was attention, a focused, absolute attention that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world. He had noticed her pain, a small, insignificant burn, and had tended to it with an instinctual, gentle care. In that moment, he was not a king or a vampire. He was just Theron, and she was just Vera. She didn't pull away immediately. For a heartbeat, then another. They stayed like that, her hand in his lips having just brushed her skin, their eyes locked. Something was kindling between them, something that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with the strange alchemy that happens when two lonely souls recognize each other. Finally, she pulled back, not from fear, but from the overwhelming nature of what she was beginning to feel. The walls inside her were not just cracked, they were gone, and she didn't know what to do with the open, vulnerable space they had left behind. The days blurred together as they approached the end of the 7th week, moving into the 8th. Vera had recovered some of her strength now that Theron was feeding less frequently, but she was still far more fragile than she'd been when this started. They were a team, a strange, two-person ecosystem locked away from the world. The cabin had ceased to be a prison and had become a sanctuary, a place outside of time, where a hunter and a king could simply be a man and a woman, trying to stay warm. They fell into an easy rhythm. He would chop the wood, she would tend the snares and prepare what little food they had. He would melt the snow while she mended their clothes. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and he would tell her stories, and she would listen. And sometimes, she would share her own stories, too. Once, she woke in the middle of the night to find him sitting by her cot, watching over her while she slept. You were shivering. I added more wood to the fire. The tenderness in his voice made her chest ache. Another time she made a joke. She couldn't even remember what it was, and he laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. A rich, warm sound that seemed to chase the shadows from the corners of the cabin. She found herself wanting to hear it again. They touched more often now. Casual brushes of hands as they passed each other in the small space. His hand steadying her when she stumbled. Her fingers adjusting the collar of his coat before he went outside. Small intimacies that spoke of growing trust and something deeper. Then one morning, they heard it. A sound they had not heard in 8 weeks. A soft, rhythmic drip. 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 They both fell silent, listening. It was the sound of snow melting off the roof, the sound of spring, the sound of the world returning. It should have been a relief. It was a death knell. The thaw meant freedom. It meant the snow would recede, the mountain passes would open. It meant they could leave. But it also meant their time was over. Out there, he was the vampire king. Out there, she was a hunter, sworn to his destruction. The peace they had forged in isolation could not survive the harsh light of the real world. The atmosphere in the cabin grew tense again, but it was a different kind of tension. It was the tension of an ending, of an impossible choice looming. Vera found herself avoiding his eyes. What would happen when the door was no longer blocked? Would they simply walk away from each other, as if the past 2 months had been a strange dream? Or would they become enemies again, the vows they had made in their old lives reasserting themselves? She noticed Theron watching her more often, his expression unreadable, as if he too were grappling with the same questions. The thaw was slow at first, then rapid. The patch of light from the window grew larger, brighter. Soon they could see a sliver of blue sky. The world was re-emerging, and they could not hide from it any longer. The day came when Theron, with a grim set to his jaw, put his shoulder to the door. The barricade Vera had made splintered, and with a great heave, he forced the door open against the heavy, wet snow outside. A shaft of brilliant, clean sunlight sliced into the dim, smoky cabin. It was blinding. Vera raised a hand to shield her eyes, breathing in the scent of damp earth and pine. The scent of life. Freedom. She stepped outside, sinking to her knees in the soft, melting snow. The sky was a vast, aching blue. The mountains, still cloaked in white, seemed less like prison walls and more like silent, majestic guardians. It was over. They had survived. She looked back at Theron. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, a tall, dark figure silhouetted against the dim interior. The sunlight did not touch him. He watched her, his face unreadable. So, I guess this is it. The deal is concluded. I kept you alive. You kept me alive. Yes. She should be happy. She was free. She could go home. But she had no home to go to. Oakhaven was a field of ash and ghosts. And the hunters, what would she tell them? That she had spent the winter saving the life of their greatest enemy? That she had fed him from her own veins? That she had read his journal and found him human? They would call her a traitor, a monster. They would likely kill her. Her old life was a ruin, and she had only just realized it. They stood there in the snow, the distance between them suddenly feeling vast, neither one willing to take the first step away. "Where will you go?" "I don't know. I don't know." He was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "You are not the same woman who shot me in that valley. You are not the same man I swore to kill." A faint smile touched his lips. "No, I am not." He stepped out of the doorway, moving into the shade of the cabin's overhang. He was closer now. "You cannot go back to them, Vera. They will not understand what happened here. They will not see what I see when I look at you." "I know." He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with something. Finally, he spoke. "Then come with me." The words hung in the clean, cold air between them. Vera's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Come with you? To your court? As what? Your prisoner? Your pet?" The old anger, the old fear flared up like a dying ember. "No, never. You would be no one's prisoner." He took another step, his face earnest, stripped of all regal artifice. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she would say no. "Vera, my court is a nest of vipers. Men like Mordecai still whisper in the shadows. They want war. They want conquest. I want peace. I have been fighting this battle alone for centuries. I am tired." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the weight of 1,000 years of solitude. "I am not offering you a gilded cage. I am not offering you comfort or safety. In fact, I am offering you the opposite. They will call me weak for bringing a human into my court. They will challenge me. Some will try to kill you to prove a point." He paused. "This will not be safe, Vera, for either of us. I am asking you to walk into a den of predators who see you as prey, and I am risking my throne, perhaps my life, to bring you there. But I would rather fight that battle with you beside me than win it alone. I am offering you a war, a different kind of war, a fight to build something better than the world that has been left to us. I am offering you a place at my side, not as a consort, not as a subject, as an equal, as a partner." She stared at him, speechless. He was offering her a purpose. He was offering her a home, not of place but of meaning. He saw her not as a human, a hunter, a woman, but as a warrior, an ally. "You are the strongest person I have ever met. You have more honor in your little finger than my entire court has in its collective memory. You see the world with clear eyes. You see me with clear eyes. I need that. I need you." The choice was laid bare before her, a past that would not have her, or a future that was terrifying, uncertain, dangerous, but not solitary. She stepped back, the weight of it too much. I need to think." He nodded slowly, though she could see the flash of pain in his eyes. "Of course. Take all the time you need." She turned away from him, away from the cabin, and started down the mountain path. Her legs were weak from weeks of limited activity, but she pushed forward, needing space, needing air, needing to think without those dark eyes watching her with such desperate hope. She walked for perhaps half an hour, following the natural path the snowmelt had carved through the drifts. The world was opening up around her, patches of brown earth showing through the white, the sound of water running beneath the snow, birdsong for the first time in months. She could keep walking. Down the mountain, away from him, away from everything. She could find a new village, a new life. She could change her name, forget she was ever a hunter, forget she ever spent 2 months in a cabin with the Vampire King. But she would be alone, always looking over her shoulder, always carrying the secret of what she had done, what she had felt. She thought of the cabin, of the shared silence, of the trust forged in blood and desperation. She thought of his hand covering hers, of his voice telling her stories in the dark, of the way he had kissed her burn with such gentle reverence. She thought of the profound, gut-wrenching loneliness that had been her only companion for 3 years, and how, in that tiny buried room, it had finally, miraculously, receded. She thought of the way her heart had started beating faster when he entered a room, the way she found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way his rare smiles made something warm bloom in her chest. She was falling in love with him, maybe had already fallen. The thought should have terrified her, should have sent her running down the mountain, away from this impossible, dangerous feeling. But instead, it felt like the first true thing she had felt in years. She turned around. She looked back up the mountain, toward the cabin, barely visible now as a dark shape against the white. Toward him. And she started walking back. Her legs burned with the effort of climbing, but she pushed on, her breath coming in white clouds. She had spent 3 years running toward vengeance. Maybe it was time to run toward something else. When she reached the cabin, Theron was standing outside, his back to her, staring out at the mountains. He must have heard her approach. He was too old, too powerful not to. But he didn't turn around, as if he was afraid of what he might see in her face. Theron. He turned slowly, his expression guarded, as if he was bracing himself for rejection. She walked up to him, stopping just a breath away. Close enough to feel the cool air that seemed to surround him, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his dark eyes. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the vampire king, but Theron, her partner in survival, her confidant, the other half of her strange, impossible story. The man who had shown her more tenderness in 2 months than she had known in 3 years. She raised her hand, not with a knife, but with an open palm. She laid it against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its slow, steady beat beneath her palm. The heart she had tried to stop. The heart she had saved. The heart she now realized she wanted to keep beating, for as long as time would allow. Okay, but not because I have nowhere else to go. Not because I'm afraid to be alone. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. A universe of emotion passed over his face. Shock, relief, joy, and a hope so profound it was painful to witness. He covered her hand with his own, his cool fingers lacing with hers, holding her there against his heart. Vera, I know. She raised her other hand to his face, her fingers brushing against his cheek. He leaned into her touch like a man starved for it, his eyes closing for a moment. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. I will protect you, with everything I am, with everything I have. They will have to go through me to reach you. She smiled, a real smile, the first in years. And they'll have to go through me to reach you. That's what partners do. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his arms, asking permission with his eyes. She answered by stepping into his embrace, letting him fold her against his chest. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and she felt safer than she had in 3 years. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other, both trembling slightly with the enormity of what they were choosing. The danger ahead, the impossible odds, the world that would call them both traitors. Thank you for seeing me, for giving me a chance, for choosing to stay. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. Thank you for waiting, for not forcing me, for letting me choose. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, and in that look was perfect understanding. They were both damaged, both haunted, both carrying wounds that might never fully heal. But they would carry them together. Together, they turned away from the cabin, their shared prison, their unlikely sanctuary, the place where everything had changed. They began the long walk down the mountain, into the bright, uncertain light of spring, their hands clasped tightly between them. The path ahead was unknown, filled with shadows and dangers. They would face opposition from his court. They would face questions and accusations. They would have to prove, day after day, that their alliance was not weakness but strength. But for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was walking it alone. And in the space between their joined hands, something precious was taking root. Not the love of fairy tales, sudden and perfect, but something harder won and more valuable. A love born of survival and sacrifice, of seeing the worst in each other and choosing to stay anyway. A love that understood that sometimes the person who saves you is the same person you once swore to destroy. And sometimes, in the ruins of who you were, you find exactly who you were meant to become. Together, they walked toward their uncertain future. Two souls who had found each other in the coldest, darkest place and emerged into the light, changed, scarred, but no longer alone. He would introduce her to his court not as a curiosity or a pet, but as his most trusted advisor. She would stand beside his throne and help him forge a new path, a better path, between their worlds. It would be hard. It would be dangerous. There would be nights when they wondered if they had made the right choice. But they would face it together. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest magic of all, that two people from opposite sides of an ancient war could find in each other not an enemy, but a home. That hate could transform into understanding, and understanding into something that looked very much like love. And as they descended the mountain, the spring sun warm on their faces, Vera Callahan and Theron Valeris carried with them a story that would one day become legend. Not a story of conquest or domination, but of two unlikely allies who chose each other against all odds. A story of redemption, of second chances, of love found in the most impossible of places, and of a future they would build together, one careful, courageous step at a time.